everybody, Luke McElroy from Mets Performance Consulting here. Following on from the video we did the other week of Ivan Dennis completing a VO2 max test on the bike, I wanted to show you behind the scenes of what the data looks like and just cover a video on acute responses to exercise. So we saw in that video of Ivan, which if you haven't seen it yet, I'll put a link in the description below. We saw that all of his acute responses were obviously increasing to the increased demand of the exercise intensity. So this isn't his data. I didn't want to give away his data. We keep that relatively top secret. So I've got an example of another person's data, which shows you exactly the same thing. So this person did the test on the bike as well. So let's just go through all the acute responses which occur as exercise intensity increases. So all our data is on the left here, averaged over 30 seconds. We've got lots of acute responses, our ventilation, our respiratory rate, our heart rate, our AVO2 difference, our VO2, and also the intensity of exercise in watts, which is our unit of power for the bike. Now, when we talk about acute responses, if we can remember the definition of VO2 max, we can get 95% of our acute responses memorized just through that definition. So back to the VO2 max definition, it's the maximum volume of oxygen which we can take in, transport, and utilize in 1 minute. So we have to take it in by the lungs, we have to transport it by the heart and cardiovascular system, we have to utilize it by the muscles. So they're the three systems that we're talking about when we're looking at acute responses: the respiratory system, cardiovascular system, and the muscular system. So let's begin with the respiratory acute responses. A few things that we can do. This graph here is ventilation. So ventilation being the amount, so the amount of air we breathe in and out in 1 minute. Ventilation is made up of respiratory rate and made up of tidal volume. Respiratory rate is breaths per minute. Tidal volume is the amount of air we breathe in per breath. Put them together, we get how much air we breathe in per minute, which is ventilation. As we can see, this individual, they began at a ventilation of 26.1. This is during exercise. So resting ventilation is generally between about 6 to 12 litres of air, depending on how big you are, how big your lungs are. So a minute into exercise, this individual was at 26.1 litres. What we can see, the general trend of the graph is as exercise intensity increases, so too will ventilation. We can see we peaked at 123.9 litres, which is between 10 and 20 times more than we would be breathing at rest. The exercise protocol, 30 watt increase every 3 minutes. So every 3 minute period, we're probably going to see a small increase in our ventilation, as we pretty much do see here, okay, and more, a sharper increase towards the end. So as exercise intensity increases, so too will ventilation. The next respiratory response is the breathing rate. Okay, so this is or our respiratory rate. So this is breaths per minute. Normally we breathe in about 12 breaths per minute at rest. When we start to exercise, obviously that's going to increase. So you can see this individual is sitting around that sort of high-ish 20s for most of the first half of the test. So if you put a straight line through here, or a line of best fit, you'd pretty much see it's relatively unchanged up until this 12-minute mark. Beyond that, we see an obvious increase in our respiratory rate. This is a really interesting one because what we see is ventilation, although it's not a huge increase, we see ventilation is consistently increasing in this first half, whereas breathing rates are not. Okay, so the only way that ventilation can increase if breathing rate remains the same is if we get an increase in tidal volume. Now, our resting tidal volume, which is how much air we're breathing in, is about half a litre, 500 mils, okay? Most people will get up to at least 2.5 litres, which is 5 times what they can breathe in at rest, because obviously we can just take deeper breaths. It's not hard to take deeper breaths. Some people have a lung capacity up to about 7 litres, which is obviously, that's on the other end of the scale. That's quite a large lung capacity, but some people can breathe in up to 7 litres of air. So in the initial stages of exercise, we don't necessarily need to increase our breathing rate too much because we can still increase our tidal volume. What happens though is that our tidal volume or our lung capacity has a finite capacity. They can only get so big. Once they are full of air, then the only way that we can increase ventilation further is by increasing our respiratory rate, which is why we see at the back half, at a higher intensity, we start to get a dramatic increase in our respiratory rate. And you can see that right at the end, this individual was breathing 61.4 breaths per minute, which is more than 1 per second, okay? So that's how we take the oxygen in. Now we need to circulate it. So we're looking at the cardiovascular system. So we've got heart rate, we've got cardiac output, and we have stroke volume. Heart rate being beats per minute, stroke volume being the amount of blood ejected from the left ventricle per beat, cardiac output being the amount of blood we can circulate in 1 minute. Cardiac output is made up of heart rate and stroke volume, as we know. So this is our heart rate graph. First 30 seconds of exercise, we're at 98 beats. By the end, we're at 178 beats. Okay. Again, general trend, as exercise intensity increases, so too does our heart rate. Now, what we see with this individual is that we get quite a lot of steady state periods. So right at the beginning of exercise, we're in what's called an oxygen deficit, which we know from our energy system interplay stuff. So we're in an oxygen deficit, then we hit a steady state because the resistance is unchanged and we're doing a 3-minute interval. So we might be in a deficit for 30 seconds to a minute, then we hit a steady state, and then you can see when we increase the intensity, so from 90 to 120 watts or 120 to 150 watts, we get a temporary oxygen deficit until we hit steady state again. Temporary deficit, steady state, temporary deficit, steady state, so on and so forth. Okay. When we add, obviously, oxygen deficit, oxygen supply does not meet oxygen demand. That's why everything's increasing. And then when we hit steady state, oxygen supply does meet demand. So in theory, everything will remain constant. What we see, however, is once we get to about this point here, we don't hit a steady state in our heart rate anymore. Okay. Now remember, cardiac output is made up of heart rate and stroke volume. Our stroke volume, like our lungs, has a finite capacity. It's only so big. If your heart's this big, it's only going to beat out that much blood per beat. So that's going to plateau midway through the test. When that plateaus, the only way we can increase our cardiac output is if our heart rate increases at the same rate. So we can't hit a steady state any longer because our stroke volume is plateaued. The only way we can increase our cardiac output is if this heart rate picks up the slack, which we can see it doing here. Also, at the end of a VO2 max test, we're also accumulating a lot of hydrogen ions, and I'm going to come back to the lactate graph soon, but we're looking at this part here, where we're accumulating a lot of lactate, a lot of hydrogen ions, and as a result of that, the heart's working overtime. It's trying to beat blood, or it's trying to circulate blood to the muscles, but it's also trying to oxidize all these hydrogen ions, and by the end of the test, generally people are starting to get pretty warm. They're also trying to redistribute blood flow to the skin, so that we can start sweating as well. So the heart's doing a lot of things to try to cool the body down, fuel performance, and also metabolize hydrogen ions. So you can see that's why it's working overtime towards the end. Coming back to dehydration, coming back to sweating, the way we sweat is we get vasoconstriction where we don't need it and vasodilation at the surface of the skin. So when we're exercising, we don't need to worry about our non-vital organs. So we need a vasoconstriction around the digestive system, the liver, the kidneys, and a little bit at the working muscles. And we need to get vasodilation at the skin so the blood will go away from where we don't need it, away from the non-vital organs to the surface of the skin. That will secrete our sweat glands. The sweat will evaporate and release heat into the environment. Okay, so the heart rate's going to work overtime because we don't really want to limit the amount of oxygen at the muscles because we're still trying to perform, but we definitely do want to send blood to the skin so we can start sweating. So again, heart rate's going to work overtime. We're not going to hit a steady state any longer because we're trying to do a lot of things at the same time. Fraction of expired oxygen. I don't want to go into too much detail about this because it's quite a complicated graph, but this is basically our AVO2 difference, all right? So AVO2 difference is in the name. It's the arterious venous oxygen difference, or the difference between oxygen concentration between the arterioles and the venules, all right? So pathway of the blood coming out of the left ventricle to the aorta, the arteries, the arterioles, which are small arteries. Then we have the capillaries where diffusion occurs, oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. Then we get to the venules, okay? So if we're looking at the oxygen difference between the arterioles and the venules, we're really looking at how much diffusion's occurred at the capillaries. Simply put, I'll start with simply put, and then I'll explain what this graph means. But simply put, if we have 100 oxygen molecules coming in to the arterioles and we have 80 coming out of the venules, the oxygen difference is 20, which means that 20 have been diffused into the capillaries, because in between the arterioles and the venules are the capillaries. When we start to exercise, we need more oxygen. So that difference is going to increase, indicating that we start to absorb more oxygen into the muscle. So if we have 100 oxygen molecules coming in and we have 50 coming out of the venules, the difference is 50, and it indicates that we've got 50 oxygen molecules being absorbed into the muscles, which is good. And this is where the elite athletes really, especially the elite endurance athletes, really separate themselves from the rest. So an elite athlete might not have a bigger lung capacity than someone else. They might not even have a bigger heart than someone else, but what they do have is a much greater capacity to actually diffuse oxygen into their muscles because they've got the chronic adaptations under the belt, which we'll talk about later. They've got the chronic adaptations like the mitochondrial density, the capillarization of the myoglobin to be able to transport that oxygen and actually be able to absorb it. But that's something we'll talk about in the next couple of months. So coming to this fraction of expired oxygen graph, you don't need to understand this in detail. If you remember AVO2 difference, then that's fine. But let me explain what we're looking at here anyway, just so we can understand it. The air is not made up of 100% oxygen. The air at sea level only has 21% oxygen, okay? Out of all the air we breathe in, 21% of that is oxygen, 0.02% is carbon dioxide, so almost nothing, and the rest of it, the other 79%, is made of nitrogen, which we can't use, okay? So this is a fraction of expired oxygen. This is how much oxygen we're breathing back out. We know that we're breathing in 21%. Assuming we're at sea level, which we are, okay? So if we're breathing in 21%, whatever we're breathing out, our fraction of expired oxygen out, is we can do the math and figure out how much has been used up in the muscle. So at rest, we'll breathe in 21, and we'll breathe out about 17, which is just here, 17%. We breathe in 21, breathe out 17, we've used up 4% of the oxygen, okay? So out of all the air we breathe in, we're only using up 4%. When we start to exercise, we need more oxygen. So straight away, our fraction of expired oxygen starts to decrease. Decreasing is good. If it decreases, it means we're getting more proportion of oxygen out of the air. So you can see this individual at their peak point, let's round that down to 15 just to make it easy for the maths. 21 is still coming in. If 15 is coming out, we're actually using 6% instead of the 4% we use at resting. So relatively speaking, going from 6% from 4% is a 50% increase in our ability to use oxygen. Now, you might get confused here because now we see that we're actually declining the amount of oxygen we can use out of that air. So you can see right towards the end, let's round that again, we're at 17.5%, which means 21's coming in. If 17.5's coming out, we're only using up 3.5%. So if AVO2 difference is increasing, how is that occurring? How are we getting less efficient at using our oxygen? And the answer is that we're not really. We're still getting more oxygen out of it because what we need to understand is that our ventilation is increasing quite a lot. So 3.5% of 123.9 is still going to be better than, let's say, for example, here at 15% at 10 minutes. It's still going to be more total oxygen than if we did the math and figured out 44.2 litres of 6%. Okay, so although we're starting to get less proportion of the oxygen out of the air, we're starting to get less proportion because there's limitations. We're coming close to VO2 max. We're getting less proportion of the oxygen out of the air, but we're still breathing in more total air. So as a result, our VO2 is still increasing towards the end, but it's just not at a linear rate. See, this is quite a steady increase in our VO2. Obviously, our ventilation is quite exponential. We're not getting the same bang for buck because of our fraction of expired becoming less efficient because of that mitochondrial density and all that sort of stuff. So that's a little bit of advanced knowledge. All you need to know here is AVO2 difference increases because we need more diffusion of the capillaries, which is why our VO2 max will go up. Last thing we'll cover here is our lactate and heart rate graph. So as we can see, heart rate's in the orange, lactate is in the blue. Very, very steady with our lactate at lower intensities, and then it starts to increase exponentially towards the end, okay? Lactic acid is a byproduct of that anaerobic glycolysis system. Lactic acid is broken down to lactate and hydrogen. Hydrogen causes fatigue, lactate doesn't. I'm going to go into that in a future video. Hydrogen will basically make our blood acidic. When that blood becomes acidic, it's going to inhibit what we call glycolytic enzymes. So the enzyme is responsible for glycolysis. It's going to make our mitochondria not create energy, long story short. So we'll go into detail about that later. Okay, but we're looking at the anaerobic. This is all to do with anaerobic contribution. If lactate goes up, we're getting an increased contribution from the anaerobic glycolysis system. If it goes down, we're getting a decreased contribution. Lactate, anything under 2 is considered resting. So this athlete was very, very aerobically fit. You can see we go from 1 to 1.1. So in terms of energy system interplay, we could say we increased very, very slightly. It's not a significant increase, but we increased our lactate accumulation in the early stages because we're in oxygen deficit, where supply does not meet demand. That's why our anaerobic systems are increasing contribution. ATP, PC in the first 10 seconds, anaerobic glycolysis up to 75 because we're trying to get the body warmed up and get these acute responses up so we can use the oxygen. In the second workload, we actually see a decrease in our lactate accumulation. The reason we see a decrease is because we've hit a steady state, so we don't have an oxygen deficit anymore. The workload is still very low. It's only 90 watts, which is very comfortable intensity. So because we're at a steady state and because the intensity is quite low, it's essentially like doing an active recovery, and we're metabolizing the hydrogen ions and metabolizing the lactate. Okay. Then as exercise intensity continues to increase, we see a very small increase the next workload, very small increase the next one, relatively small the next one, and then we see a big spike, okay? So you can see here we go from 2.6 to 6.9. This point here is called lactate inflection point. So it's a point at which lactate entry, the last point at which lactate entry equals removal, okay? After that, we see an exponential or a sudden sharp increase in our lactate accumulation. So this point indicates the max intensity we can hold for 45 to 60 minutes, because beyond that, we start to accumulate a lot of lactate, lactic acid, which is going to create fatigue. We're not concerned with small increments. We're looking in a lab setting, we look for a 2 millimole increase. So for example, if it went from 2.6 to 4.6, we know we've exceeded a lit, but we're not concerned with 1.8 to 2.6. That's not even 1 millimole. It's an insignificant increase. So the last point before that exponential increase. Now guys, the reason we measure lactate, blood lactate in a lab, is because there's a direct correlation between the amount of lactate we have and the amount of hydrogen ion accumulation we have. So hydrogen ions cause fatigue. Lactate actually doesn't. It can be used for energy later on. But we can't measure hydrogen easily, but we do know that one lactic acid molecule breaks down into one lactate and one hydrogen. Therefore, if we have 100 lactate, we know we have 100 hydrogen ions. So it's a direct correlation of fatigue. Yeah, so as you see here, an exponential increase in our lactic acid or our lactate, and even though we're getting a big increase in our anaerobic glycolysis contribution, we are still aerobically dominant at the end of a VO2 max test. So don't get fooled and say, hey, we're getting a lot of this lactate, which we get from the anaerobic glycolysis system, therefore we must be going from aerobically dominant to anaerobically dominant. It's not the case. We know that from the aerobic system we get 36 to 38 ATP. We know that from the anaerobic glycolysis system we only get 2 to 3 ATP. So we get about 18 times more energy if we use the aerobic system. The way I like to explain this is that, well, there's two ways we can explain it. One is that we would need to 18 times our energy output to go from being aerobically dominant to anaerobically dominant. We're not going that much. Our intensity is not increasing much. We only go from here from 180 watts up to 210 watts up to 240 watts. So they're very minute. They're like 15% increments. It's not like we're 1,500 timesing our energy output. So the intensity is not increasing that much. The body just can't tolerate and buffer that lactic acid anymore. Okay, so it's starting to accumulate and cause fatigue. The other way I like to explain it is that we don't require any oxygen whatsoever for the anaerobic glycolysis system or the ATP-PC system to work. So if you can't go back and look at the video of Ivan, or you just use a practical example of yourself, go for a run, go for a 5K run. Imagine trying to hold your breath, all right? You're not going to last very long, particularly at the high intensities when you're about to hit your VO2 max. You're not going to be able to hold your breath for very long. That's a perfect indicator to say that, hey, we are still aerobically dominant because we need the oxygen. If we were anaerobically dominant, we could hold our breath because we don't require any oxygen whatsoever. So the terminology we want to use is at the end of a VO2 max test, or even at a higher intensity, we are still aerobically, the aerobic glycolysis system is still dominant. However, we're getting an increased contribution from the anaerobic glycolysis system. So if at sub-max workloads it was 90% aerobic and 10% anaerobic, now we might be only 80% aerobic and 20% anaerobic, but we're never going to go back to 50-50 or the other way if it's a continuous exercise test, okay? So that's a bit of a summary of the acute responses. So just come back to that VO2 max definition, maximum volume of oxygen we can take in, transport, utilise, which means we're looking at the respiratory, cardiovascular and muscular systems. As exercise intensity increases, all those acute responses will increase so that we can get rid of that oxygen deficit and attempt to hit a steady state. Hopefully that was useful, guys. Good luck with your sacs.